Today I want to talk about influencing the next generation for God. I think it's appropriate because, like I said, it's Mother's Day, and there's a lot of mothers out there that have influenced us and their children, and who are influencing. If you're a mother today, you're influencing your children right now. But I want you to know that any one of us can influence the next generation. So don't check out on this message, because this is not just a message for mothers. It's for all of us who want to influence the next generation. How many of you want to see young people, this next generation, serving God? You want to see them on fire for God, where they are up here worshiping, their hands raised, they're singing to God, they're praying on their own, they're doing miracles because the Holy Spirit has filled them, and they're doing things, amazing things in their community, on their campus. How many of you want to see that? Can I just tell you something? That's not going to happen unless we influence them. We have a huge responsibility to influence the next generation for God. If we don't, who will? It is possible that even if you don't influence your children, or a child isn't raised with a godly influence, they can find a way to connect with God. It is possible, but the odds are very much against them. They need godly influences. They need people who will rise up and say, I will teach them. I will guide them. I will influence them to serve God, to love God. I want to focus on a story in the Bible. And it's a story of 3 generations of people. 3 generations that failed to influence the next generation. The first generation is a generation of Israelites that were slaves in Egypt. I'm just going to give you a background of each generation and talk about what they did right and what they did wrong. This first generation of Israelites were slaves in Egypt. And God sent a man named Moses to set them free. Moses led them out of Egypt. After many, many plagues, finally Moses leads them out of Egypt and leads them to a mountain called Mount Sinai, where they were to meet God. After their encounter with God on Mount Sinai, God sent them through the desert to the promised land that He was going to provide to them. But when the Israelites got to the promised land, they sent out some spies. They sent out 12 spies to spy out this land and see what they were going to get and how difficult it was going to be to conquer. And those 12 spies went into the land and they spied it out. And when they came back, 10 of them said, no way, it ain't going to happen. The walls are too big. The people are too big. It's just, we're toast. It ain't going to happen. And only 2 of them said, no, God's with us. We can do it. But the people began to follow the 10 spies. And they started to believe that God couldn't do it. They weren't strong enough. And they began to complain and lose heart. So God punished them. He told them that because of their lack of faith in Him, He was sentencing them to wander the desert until all of that generation passed away. And once all of them had died off, then God would take the new generation and lead them into the promised land. So the Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years until all of that generation had died off. There were only 2 of that generation that God spared. He says, it was the 2 spies. He says, Joshua and Caleb. He says, you get to live. You get to join this new generation as they go into the promised land because you believed in me. Everyone else was condemned to die in the desert. Here's what's amazing. Once this old generation died off, the new generation, under the leadership of Joshua and with the help of God, they conquered the promised land. This new generation was on fire for God. And because of their faith in God and their faithfulness to God, God did amazing things through them. This is the generation that saw the walls of Jericho fall because they walked around them and they blew their trumpets. And these walls that were too high for that other generation suddenly crumbled just simply because they walked around them 7 times and blew trumpets. And God did it. This is the generation that saw the Jordan River divide in half so that the Israelites were able to walk across on dry ground. This is the generation that, get this, this is the generation that witnessed God making the sun stand still in the sky so that they could continue to defeat their enemies. I've never seen that. Have you seen that? Literally, the sun would not go down until they were done. When you read about the second generation, you get the impression they didn't want to end up like their parents. They didn't want to displease or anger God. They were careful to serve Him faithfully. In fact, there's this story. They were just so zealous for God. There's a story in the Old Testament where the Israelites, once they conquered the land, they divided it up, right? And they sent the different tribes, got sections of the land. And there was 12 of them, 12 tribes. And 3 of those tribes, after they settled their portion of the land, they decided to build this incredible altar. It was this huge altar on their portion of the land. And when the rest of the tribes heard about it, they were angry. They got together and they marched to go destroy them. Because it was against the law of God to build a second altar. There was only supposed to be one altar in a particular spot in the land of Israel, where people would gather together and worship God. And so they thought that these 3 tribes were breaking the law of God, and so they were like, we're going after them. Listen to this. This is what it says in Joshua 22, 15 through 18. It says this: when they arrived in the land of Gilead, they said to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, the whole community of the Lord demands to know why you are betraying the God of Israel. How could you turn away from the Lord and build an altar for yourselves in rebellion against Him? Was our sin at Peor not enough? To this day we are not fully cleansed of it, even after the plague that struck the entire community of the Lord. And yet today you are turning away from following the Lord. If you rebel against the Lord today, He will be angry with all of us tomorrow. They were having none of it. They were going to make sure that they were zealous for God, that they continued to serve God. They did not want to fail God like their fathers and their mothers. You know what's sad? Is that first generation, they were basically they were like the drunk uncle that you tell your kids you don't want to end up like him. Right? They were a cautionary tale. You don't want to be like them. Look at their life. It's a mess. You don't want to be like that. Serve God. Live for God. The second generation was so zealous for God. But here comes the sad part. After this second generation, who was so zealous for God, they died off. The next generation, their children grew up, and they were nothing like their parents. In fact, I want you to read this, or I want to read it with you in the Bible about this third generation. It says this in Judges 2, 6 through 12. It says, after Joshua sent the people away, each of the tribes left to take possession of the land allotted to them. And the Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the leaders who outlived him, those who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the land he had been allocated at Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. After that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. Can you just imagine? These godly parents who served God so faithfully, so zealously. I mean, they were willing to go after and punish those 3 tribes because they built an altar and were rebelling against God. I mean, they were zealous for Him. And they produced a generation that rejected God. How did that happen? Somehow the godly generation failed to influence the next generation. There was a disconnect. Now it may seem, it may be that some of the parents that were a part of the godly generation had done everything right. Maybe they did everything right. Maybe they taught them the Bible. Maybe they talked to them about God and just did everything right, like everything they should have done. There is no guarantees, parents, there's no guarantees that your children, you can do everything right and that your children will follow God. God Himself had children, right? Adam and Eve. And what did they do? They rebelled against Him. You can't get more perfect than God as a parent, right? He did everything right, and they still rebelled. There is no guarantees. But we're talking about a whole generation. A whole generation that rejected God. Something went terribly wrong. Somehow these godly parents had failed their children. I don't know how, I don't know about you, but this is a real concern for my wife and I. We really want to make sure that our boys follow God. We do everything we can, but you know what? We also know there's no guarantees. Now we have some good boys, and they're doing well. But there is no guarantees. But my wife and I are committed to raising godly young men. So what can we do? How can we influence the next generation? Whether you're a parent, a grandparent, or someone who cares about and interacts with this next generation, how can we influence them so that they will serve God? Because listen, that second generation, something went wrong. There was a disconnect. It's not just that a few of them failed. It's that they all failed. They didn't do something right. How do we make sure that we don't fail? I'm going to give you 3 things. 3 things that we can do. And the first thing is this. If you want to influence the next generation, you need to do these things. And the first thing is this. Teach them to love God. Now it may sound simple, but listen. As Christians, it's easy for us to fall into the trap of making our relationship with God just about do's and don'ts, right? Don't do that. Don't do this. Do this. Don't do that, right? It's all a bunch of rules. We don't do that because God said so. We don't watch movies because God said so. We go to church because God said so. How many of you ever had a parent say that to you, told you to do something, and when you asked why, they said, because I said so, right? How many of you like that, right? Nobody likes that, right? And when you actually gave in and started doing whatever your parent told you to do, were you passionate about it? No. You weren't passionate about it. None of us were. If we want our children to be passionate, if we want this next generation to be passionate in love with God, then we have to do more than recite to them a bunch of do's and don'ts. We have to help them to fall in love with God. So how do we do that? First, we have to understand that rules do not inspire people. People are inspired when their emotions are engaged. So we have to engage their emotions. Instead of telling them that they can't do this or they can't do that because God said so, teach your children to love God by sharing with them all the good things that He has done in your life. All the amazing things He has done for you and why you fell in love with Him. When they fall in love with God, then they will be inspired to obey Him and serve Him. This is what Moses said to the godly generation right before they went in to capture the promised land. This is what he says to them in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20 through 25. This is that generation that failed. They were godly for themselves, but they failed to influence the next generation. This is what Moses taught them before they even went into the promised land. This is what he says. He says, in the future, when your children ask you, what is the meaning of the laws, commands, and rules the Lord our God gave us? Tell them, we were slaves to the king of Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt by His great power. The Lord showed us great and terrible signs and miracles which He did to Egypt, the king, and his whole family. The Lord brought us out of Egypt to lead us here and to give us the land He promised our ancestors. The Lord ordered us to obey all these commands and to respect the Lord our God so that we will always do well and stay alive as we are today. The right thing for us to do is this: obey all these rules in the presence of the Lord our God as He has commanded. Basically what Moses is saying, he says, listen, when your children ask why they're supposed to do this or that, you got to tell them more than just because God said so. They were supposed to explain about all the miracles, all the wonders that God had done for them. They were supposed to teach their children about all those wonderful things the miracles that God had performed on their behalf. And they were supposed to say, listen, this is why we obey these laws. Because we owe all of it. We owe everything. Everything we are, everything we have, we owe it all to Him. But I don't think they did that. I think they forgot to share those details. And the reason I say that is because listen to this. Listen to Judges 2:10. It says this: after that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things He had done for Israel. They didn't remember the mighty things that God had done for Israel. It's as if the godly generation didn't emphasize the miracles of God. They emphasized the rules. This is how you got to live because God said so. They forgot to tell their children about all the wonders that God had done for them, all the amazing things. If you want to influence this next generation for God, then you've got to start telling them the stories of how God has changed your life. Tell them the stories of how He's provided for you. Help them understand the goodness of God. Help them understand that that is why you serve Him. Because you are in love with Him. Not because you got a list from your parents of the do's and don'ts. Because you love Him. If you don't do this, they won't fall in love with God. They will just see Christianity as a bunch of do's and don'ts. And that is empty. The second thing you can do to influence the next generation for God is teach them how to follow God. This is so important. We have a responsibility to teach our children and this next generation how to follow God. Now, here's the thing. Now, for a lot of Christian parents, they go, oh, yeah, I do that, right? I do that. Sure. But what they really mean is that I send my children to children's church or to youth group, and I pay good money for a Christian school, so we're good, right? But here's the problem. These parents are handing off their kids for someone else to teach their children about God and how to follow Him. That's not enough. If you bring your children to children's church every week, the children's church workers are getting about an hour to an hour and a half every week. That's it. Not only that, but there's about 10 to 20 kids sometimes in that room. And those children's workers, they don't have enough time to focus on every individual kid. We can't rely on church or Sunday school to teach our children how to follow God. That's not enough. We have to take it upon ourselves to personally teach them the Bible and how to follow God's commands. Listen to what Moses told the godly generation, again, before they went into the promised land. This is what he says in Deuteronomy 6, 5 through 7. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road, when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Notice he didn't say anything about sending them to children's church or youth ministry or handing them off to the youth pastor. He says, you teach them. You teach them. He said, talk about the laws of God with your children over and over again. When you're at home, when you're traveling on the road, before you go to bed, when you wake up, talk about God. Talk about Him. Teach them. You know, the best thing to remember things is through repetition. If you want to memorize something, repeat it over and over and over again, right? That's how we do it. If you want to learn a new skill, repeat it over and over again. It's the same with teaching children about God. We have to repeatedly talk to them about Him. We can't leave it to Sunday. Take every opportunity to teach your children and train them in the ways of God. Do a Bible time at night. Even if it was just once a week, that's better than nothing. But maybe do it regularly. Maybe instead of reading them a story before they go to sleep, read a Bible story. Amen. Talk about it with them. Ask them what it means and what they can learn from it. When you're watching a movie or TV program and someone does something that makes a bad decision or a bad choice, stop afterwards. You can do it afterwards. My kids love this. I pause the movie. I pause it right then. I say, listen, what they did, that choice that they made, what do you think how do you think God feels about that? They love it. They love it when I do that. This action scene, and I'm going to pause. Let's talk about them. I always say this. Let's talk about the morals of this. I do this, seriously. They'll tell you I do it. But maybe you don't do it right then. Maybe you don't like me. You're not mean like me. Maybe you let them watch the movie and then afterwards talk about it and say, listen, what about that choice that he made? How would God feel about that? Was that right or wrong? Why do you think? Take those opportunities. That's what I do. I especially do that when I'm watching a movie and I'm like, whoa, they're doing some stuff. They're making some choices that I don't want my kids to get influenced by that. So that's why I'll pause and say, hey, let's talk about this. So I kind of turn it around, kind of use them as a cautionary tale and say, you know what? I don't know. How does God feel about that? What do you think about that? Because we got to take every opportunity to teach our kids and teach that next generation. When you're on vacation somewhere beautiful, take the time to marvel with your children about how God has made such a wonderful world. Every opportunity. Take every opportunity. Spend time teaching and training this next generation how to follow God. The godly generation of the Israelites were told the same thing that I'm telling you today, but they failed to do it. You got to wonder, did they even do it at all? Did they spend time teaching their kids about God? I kind of get the impression they forgot. It seems like they just kind of expected their kids to grow up and know God and follow Him like they did. Kind of like osmosis. As long as the kids were around church people and they were around godly parents, then they'll just kind of soak it up, right? And they'll just become Christians. It just happens. That's how it works, right? No, it isn't how it works. If that's how it works, then God would have told them, teach the children over and over again. Spend time investing in the next generation. Unfortunately, a lot of Christian parents think the same way that godly generation think. They think because their children are in church that they're going to just soak everything up. And it doesn't work that way. So first we need to teach them to love God. Then we need to teach them how to follow God. But finally, we need to help them experience God for themselves. This is probably the most important of the three. Because the last 2 points were all about parents and godly mentors talking to this next generation about God. But how many of you have fallen asleep in church? Right? How many? Some of you just woke up and, you're like, what? But seriously, how many of you fallen asleep in church? Or how many of you have been in a Bible study and you're just like, oh, when is this over? Right? Never when I was doing it, but, that's because knowledge alone can be boring. How many of you have ever been in school? Maybe, okay, let's take your pressure off. Maybe it's not church, all right? Maybe you've been in school and you're listening to this professor drone on and on and on, and you're just like, oh gosh. That's because knowledge alone is boring. To really get excited, we have to experience things for ourselves. The Israelites were told to teach their children about all the wonderful things God did for them. But they needed to do even more than that. They needed to help their children to have their own encounters with God. Telling story after story of the good old days when God did amazing miracles is wonderful. But after a while, they just become stories. The children need to know that they can experience God for themselves right now. As a youth pastor, I came across so many young people who called themselves Christians. But it was really because their parents were Christians. It was almost as if they just kind of inherited Christianity, They had no passion or desire for God. You could tell that if their parents hadn't come to church, am I on? Okay. If their parents hadn't come to church, they wouldn't have come either. They would have been fine with it. Do you know, I used to be that way. My parents stopped coming for about a month and a half, and I was like, cha-ching, sleeping in on Sunday, woohoo, loving it, right? Because I was just there because they were there. But you know what's amazing? Were the times when those same young people suddenly had an encounter with God, apart from their parents. And all of a sudden, they were Christians because they chose to be. It was as though a switch was flipped. I love seeing that switch flip. When it's just like a light comes on. And they're Christians because they choose to be. Not just because their parents brought them. not just because they inherited it. I told you that I used to be like that, right? I used to be like, man, I don't want to, I'm glad my parents aren't going to church, I'm sleeping in. Well, then all of a sudden my friend invites me to his church, and there's a whole story. I don't want to go too far into it, but there was a pretty girl, and so I said, hey, I'll keep coming, and so I kept coming and got hooked in. Just kind of liked being there, So I was going to church on my own, to a totally different church than the church my parents went to. And all of a sudden, actually they took us on a summer camp. This church took us on a summer camp. And during that summer camp, my friend and I, we rededicated our lives to God. We got on fire for God during that camp. Came back, changed all kinds of stuff in our lives. We just got super pumped and just excited about being for God. I was going to church. Literally, think about this. My parents had nothing to do with this church. It was actually a Baptist church. My parents were Pentecostal like we are, and I was going to a Baptist church, okay? And I was showing up all the time. I was showing up Sunday morning. I was showing up Sunday evening. I was going to youth group. I was there when the doors were open. I was staying late for potlucks. I was there. When they went over to somebody's house to eat more food, the rest of the church, I was getting a ride and I was going with them. Because I was pumped. I was in fire for God. You see, suddenly I wasn't there because my parents were there. I was there because I chose to be. Because I loved God. Switch got flipped. That's why I mentioned to you earlier in this service about summer camp. Maybe you don't have kids right now, or maybe your kids are all grown up, but you can still impact the next generation. Maybe it's as simple as making a way for some of those young people to go to summer camp so they can have that switch flipped. So how do we help our children experience God for themselves? By helping them connect with God in a personal way on their level. Let me tell you this. If you're a parent, here's some things that you can do. But even if you're not, you can do this with any young person that you have influence with. If they have a need or a problem, encourage them to pray over it. Encourage them to ask God to intervene on their behalf. A lot of times what we do as parents especially is we try to fix all our kids' problems on our own. Instead, take the opportunity to encourage them to pray over their problems themselves. Pray with them, but let them lead the prayer. And then when God answers the prayer, point it out to them and say, isn't God amazing? Isn't He amazing? Look what He did because you prayed. God doesn't care how small you are. God doesn't care how young you are. He will intervene when you ask Him to. Amen. Another idea is if the family has a need or a problem, involve them in prayers for those needs. If someone is sick, have them lead the prayer for healing. If there is a financial need, ask them to pray with you over it. Even if it's not a need, but maybe something you want as a family, pray about it together and make sure that they pray. Amen. Don't just you pray and they pray, they just kind of stand there with their head bowed. No, you say you pray for it. And I'll pray with you. Amen. The reason you do that is that when God answers the prayer, they know that He answered their prayer. Not just your prayer. My family, we have a story, and my boys know it well. We had Kim's cousin was getting married down in LA, and she's very close to her family, and so we knew we needed to go down there for the wedding, and so we were making preparations to go down there, but we also knew it's LA, right? Disneyland. And we have been stuck up in Quincy forever, and so we really wanted our boys to be able to experience Disneyland. We, at least one time, something. And so we didn't have the money, and it was going to be quite a bit. I think it was almost like $1,000, $1,500, and we didn't have that. And so we said, you know what? We're going to pray. We're going to ask God for it. And we told our kids, we told our boys, listen, we're going to pray as a family. And we made sure that they prayed. And we explained it to them and say, listen, God doesn't have any obligation to make it so possible for us to go to Disneyland. This is simply something that we are desiring, we would like. Okay? So we're going to present it that way. We're going to say, God, would you please bless us with this so that we can do this as a family. We can enjoy this trip. And we made sure that they understood that if we're leaving it in God's hands, we're trusting Him for this because we believe He will do it. But if He doesn't, it's okay. It's okay. There's a reason. And so we prayed and prayed and prayed, and literally it was my wife and I were sitting down at the computer, and we were kind of tense with each other because we knew we didn't have the money. It hadn't come in. God hadn't provided yet. And we were just like frustrated, and we, of course, we're taking it out on each other a little bit. And we're doing the books, and of course we're like, I don't know what we're thinking, like somehow it's magically going to appear on the screen, as we're doing our books, our checkbook and everything. And we're sitting there, we're just kind of looking at each other, and literally while we're sitting there, someone walks into our home, someone who knew us, walks into our home, lays down an envelope. Let me tell you this. Nobody knew about what we were praying for. Lays an envelope in my wife's lap and says, we just wanted to bless you. We open the envelope, it's more than enough to go to Disneyland. So what we did is we went back to the boys and we said, listen, remember all those times we prayed as a family? Remember all those times that you prayed? Look what God did. Because He is a good God. And He loves us. He didn't have to give us a trip to Disneyland. We told you that. But He did it because He loves us. Because He loves you. We made sure they knew. They prayed. And God loved them. You see, that's what we got to do, folks. We can't do everything for our kids. We need to make sure that they are experiencing God for themselves. We've got to help them to experience Him. I don't know about you, but when I read the verse that describes how that next generation grew up and didn't acknowledge God, it makes me sad. I wonder if those parents somehow failed their children. Then I wonder, am I doing enough to ensure that my children are growing up to know God? I want to ask you, are you doing enough? Are you doing enough? Now I know some of you are like, you know what? My kids are gone, man. I'm like, I'm like a grandparent. Listen, let me tell you something about my grandmother. My grandmother, every time I visit her, she would read me Bible stories. I'd lay in bed with her and she'd read me these Bible stories. My favorite was Samuel when he got called by God in the temple. She would read me over and over again. She would read me Bible stories. One day, I was about 5, maybe 6 years old. I was driving with her to a friend's house, and she turned to me and she said, do you want to accept Jesus into your life? And I said, yes. And I prayed the prayer right there with her. My parents were godly man and woman, but it was my grandmother who led me to the Lord. Grandparents, you have the ability to influence the next generation. Maybe even more so than the parents. Because the grandparents, they get to be the fun ones, right? The kids actually listen to you. Their parents are just the talking heads sometimes, right? Right? Like Charlie Brown's mom, right? But they listen to. Yeah, exactly. Wah, wah, wah. But they might listen to. They might listen to you. You need to influence them just as much, if not more so, than the parents. And maybe you're here and you're like, I don't even have kids. There's a lot of kids in this church. There's a lot of kids in your neighborhood. You may be an uncle, an aunt, that you can still influence the next generation. The question is, are you? Are you?